Hi there, good morning everyone. That's 10:30, so I think we'll make a start. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Colin Kissock. I'm the product owner for the PaaS and CaaS platform at NatWest Group, and we're here today to talk about dev spaces on ROSA. What we'll discuss today, just to sort of give you a bit of background of what we're doing. So who is NatWest Group? The project context, why we're doing what we did, what we're doing in detail, the dev spaces environments, what makes things more complex, and ideas and suggestions, and obviously conclusions. So it's just starting there. Who is NatWest Group? So the NatWest Group, formerly the Royal Bank of Scotland Group, is a large UK and commercial bank headquartered in Edinburgh, Scotland. Our history goes back 300 years, and we're an amalgamation of over 200 banks that have come together over the years to form the bank that we are today. Brands include NatWest, Royal Bank of Scotland and Ulster Bank, as well as Coutts, who provide private banking and wealth management, and Holt's Military Bank, which provides services, banking services for UK armed forces, both home and abroad. We also support corporate and institutions in the UK, Western Europe, US, Asia, and a comprehensive range of banking services. During our history, the bank has pioneered a number of innovative banking solutions. In 1728, we were the first bank to issue overdrafts to customers, and more recently, in 2011, we released the world's fully functioning first mobile banking application. Today, we're a relationship bank for the digital world, with a customer base of around 19 million, with 10 million regular digital customers, and in fact, 63% of our active current account holders interact solely using our digital channels. Technology and innovation is important to the bank, and 8,000 of our 60,000 staff are either software engineers or infrastructure engineers managing platforms. This number is likely to increase in the future, which leads to part of what we're talking about today. We've been on a digital cloud journey for a number of years, and we've delivered platforms and applications both in private and public clouds, and we've delivered developer experiences to make that happen. However, like all organizations, our customers and our businesses are looking for us to deliver faster than ever before. This has meant we've had to look at a number of things, including our developer experience, to see what we can improve. This has resulted in a number of initiatives across the bank to enhance the experience, to reduce complexity and time to market, for new products, features, and services, which ultimately enable us to continue to be a bank that champions potential, helping people, families, and businesses to thrive, which is the tagline that's on screen. So today, in terms of project context, for some time, the bank has been improving the way we deliver applications across application teams, and the way that they develop and run applications within a highly regulatory environment, where security is paramount and regulatory compliance is mandatory, and our customers expect us to be agile and innovative. But most organizations, we have challenges such as multiple tool chains, administrative overhead for developers is perhaps not as optimized quite as it should be, and a large amount of cognitive load, especially for new engineers or engineers moving to different areas within the bank who perhaps do the similar things but in different ways. The goals of the work were to simplify the route to live, provide common tooling regardless of execution venue, so we have private cloud, public clouds, support a hosting strategy for application modernization and containerization, and accelerate onboarding for new engineers. So the reason we're here today is for Anton to talk about one of the initiatives, Dev Spaces on ROSA. The work is part of our engineering transformation program, which is focusing on a number of areas to ensure that developers are as productive as possible from the day they start working at the bank. So I'll hand over to Anton now, and he'll take you through the next part. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin, for the great introduction and for setting the context for the next part. So I have a lot to cover, but I like to start with a short story. It's a story about a person who wanted to become a developer. He worked hard to get his degree. It took him 5.5 years to get an IT degree. And then he landed his first job in this really cool company called Red Hat. And he received his first developer machine. It was a state-of-the-art Lenovo. It had Fedora installed. He was admin. He could install whatever he wanted. It had 16 gigs of RAM, which was a lot back in the days. But then this person, he wanted to understand how the software is developed by Red Hat customer. He wanted to see what the real world looks like. So he joined Red Hat Consulting, which gave him this opportunity. So shortly after, he landed his first project at a big enterprise customers. But things were looking a bit different once he joined this customer. There was no Fedora, there was no OS X, there was no 32 gigs of RAM, there was VDI, there was Citrix. So he was asked to deliver mission-critical features, and this was the tool which he received. Okay, so he got over it, it's fine, he can make it work. He will just install his favorite tool on that particular machine. No, he won't. He's not an admin even of that machine. So enabling developers at scale is hard, and I know this by experience because I am that person from that story. So the previous slides, they were not supposed to be an insult at NatWest. I was not taking a shot at NatWest. I've been onboarded at maybe 10, 15, or 20 customers in my career, and the onboarding process ranges from average to abysmal, and it's somewhere in between always. It's never perfect. There are multiple issues why that onboarding is hard. There are multiple challenges which we want to solve, and on top of those which Colin already presented, I want to go through some more, and I want to show you what exactly we are trying to solve at NatWest. So every company is an IT company these days. If it wasn't, you wouldn't be sitting in this room probably. But how do we want to attract talent, and how do we want to retain the talent if your developers' tools are, obsolete and old, and there are a lot of processes which needs to be followed? Like, you want those good engineers in your company to move fast, right? So this is one big theme of what we are doing. We want to attract the talent. You hire those engineers and those developers so they deliver value, and the way they deliver value is usually by working on mission-critical features which they are publishing and deploying to production. If your developers, your new hires, needs to be raising ServiceNow tickets, and if they need to fight with JDK version of their Windows environment, it means they are not delivering value. So I question for yourself, how many days it takes for your new hire to push a production-ready feature all the way to production? Is it hours, days, weeks? Is it months? Whatever the answer is, that's the time these employees are not delivering value, but you are paying them the same money, right? So as Colin had at his slides, NatWest employs 8,000 engineers. So we need to be really conscious about cost. We want to make sure we are only paying for the tools which are useful for these engineers. And we also want to make sure we are only paying for what is actually being used right now. Again, this wouldn't be an issue if we were talking about 10, 20, 50 engineers, but we are talking about thousands of developers. And that's why cost control matters. So as a developer, when I worked at Red Hat on my shiny MacBook with 32 gigs of RAM, I loved my inner development loop, and by inner development loop, I mean I was able to quickly compile the code locally, I was able to run my applications locally, I was able to quickly test them, and when I felt the feature is ready, that's when I knew, okay, it's time to do a Git push, and then the CI/CD pipeline takes over. So that inner development loop was amazing for me when working on my Red Hat machine, but when there is a VDI and Citrix involved, it's not really all that effective. And again, this is directly connected to those engineers not really adding value when they're fighting this ineffective development loop. The infamous phrase, works on my machine, is another big theme which we are trying to solve. I'm sure many of you in this room experienced is that the software can be compiled and run and executed on one developer's environment, but for whatever reason, it doesn't work at another. This is hard. Like, it's hard to have that consistent development environment which will work in the same unified way across thousands of developers' machines. It's a genuinely hard problem to solve. And last but not least, I want to talk a little bit about slow cloud adoption. So I've met numerous, I would say, rockstar developers who are really smart and skilled at their craft. They can put awesome algorithms in place. But what they occasionally lack is that understanding of what it means to make applications cloud native. That's where the world is moving. That's where we are deploying these applications. So not only we need to be skilled at our craft as programmers and engineers, we also need to understand what happens when we are finished with the feature. That application is going to be deployed at cloud, but often there is a skills gap between how it behaves locally and how the application is going to be used and deployed and behave on the cloud platform. So these are all the challenges which we are now looking to solve at NatWest. So it shouldn't come as a surprise at this point in presentation that we are building a platform at NatWest with dev spaces at the heart of it. Dev spaces, in the simplest terms, it's a containerized IDE accessible from within developer's browser. It's as simple as that. You might be familiar with some GitLab or GitHub offerings, like you can open VS Code like directly from public instance of GitHub these days. You might also be familiar with Developer Sandbox. If you roam around the room, like it's available downstairs. But these are a bit different than what we are doing at NatWest. Like these are publicly facing services, practically no restrictions in place. The NatWest situation is a bit different. As Colin said, the security is key. There are a lot of networking restrictions in place. So those publicly facing services, they don't really resemble the real world. They probably don't really resemble what you are trying to do at your environment. So I want to show you in the next slide like the core idea of the platform. Just before I do, just a really like 2 simple questions to the audience. With a quick show of hands, who knows what is OpenShift pod? Okay. And who knows what is EC2 instance? Okay, so you know more about AWS than you know about OpenShift, but that's fine. We'll work it out. So this is an extremely high-level diagram of our platform. If my peers at NatWest would see, they would probably roll their eyes because it's too high-level. But I think it displays those core ideas of our solution. So at the heart of it, we have an OpenShift ROSA cluster. ROSA stands for OpenShift Service on AWS. So on top of ROSA, we deploy the dev spaces. So the key feature of the ROSA cluster is that it's a managed service. So it takes the maintenance burden from us, from NatWest. We delegate a lot of operational tasks to Red Hat SRE team. Which means we can focus on what really matters for us in this context, and that's building developer-friendly platform. So those of you who knows what OpenShift pod is, those are those blue boxes which says Developer 1 and Developer 2 workspaces. It might be obvious, but it's actually a crucial thing that one instance of the workspace, and by workspace I literally mean an instance of VS Code, for example, or the instance of IntelliJ IDEA, they run in a separate OpenShift pod. And this is absolutely crucial to understand. There isn't a single pod with thousands of VS codes. Every workspace equals one OpenShift pod. The reason why this matters is it allows us to scale horizontally massively. As Colin said, 8,000 developers. This is not a POC. We are building a real platform for real production purposes. So that's why that particular design trait is absolutely critical to what we are trying to do at NatWest. So since ROSA logically runs on AWS, we can actually scale out really easily. So we are configuring machine autoscalers. So we have some bare minimum kind of worker nodes. But when the load picks up, when more and more developers logs in the morning, we can dynamically provision new worker nodes. We can borrow new EC2 instances, and we can scale potentially to thousands of developers in a matter of minutes, which is extremely powerful. And when those developers log off the platform, we will scale down dynamically those EC2 instances, which again directly is tied to that cost control which we are trying to achieve. Okay, I think I just lost the battery in this thing. Oh no, it's back. So we talk about the high-level design, but I want to make it a bit more specific for you to understand what exactly we are doing as like owners of that platform and administrator of the platform, so you have a better idea of the actual tasks which are related to setting up this solution at NatWest. There is one thing I'd like you to keep in mind. So whatever decision we made as the owners of the platform, we made with focus on one simple thing. We want to make it as easy as possible for developers to use the platform. So we are willing to invest a lot of effort on our side to automate as much as possible, to pre-configure as much as possible. So developers come, they log in, and it simply works. It's ready to go. So there are three basic pillars of that configuration. So the first one that represents the config related to the dev spaces itself, to the product itself. The second is namespaces configurator, and then we are using GitOps, or it's in the roadmap to use GitOps. So let me just give you those specific tasks. So when developer clones his repo, and when he wants to push something in that Git repo, he needs to provide some sort of credentials, either username and password, or a personal access token, or SSH keys. But when developers use this VS Code in a browser, it would mean he would somehow need to make these credentials accessible in the cloud. That would be a manual task for this developer. It would mean he wouldn't be able to use the platform immediately. But there is a better way. We are actually using GitLab OAuth integration, which is an industry security standard. So we delegate that token creation to GitLab, actually. So GitLab generates token. That's automatically made available inside the workspace. So when our developer logs in and he do git push, it will just work. There is no need for him to set up any credentials. We also notice that when the workspace or the VS Code or IntelliJ, when it starts for the very first time on a given node, many of the container images actually needs to be downloaded. So I'm talking about potentially 4 to 5 gigabytes worth of images. This takes time. This occasionally took 4, 5, 6 minutes. And if we were that unlucky developer who was scheduled on that node for the very first time, it meant that he had to wait for his workspace, for 5 to 6 minutes. Luckily, dev spaces allow us to pre-pull the images on every single node. It's using daemon set behind the scenes, so whatever work node we spin up, it automatically pre-pulls every image we tell it to pre-pull. So basically, we reduce that startup time from minutes to seconds. And obviously, again, directly correlated to cost control. When the workspace is not used for, let's say, 1 hour, 2 hours, we can save whatever number of hours we want. It will be scaled down to 0. But that's not really a big deal because the workspaces are persisted by default. So the developer will not lose any data. And since the workspace startup is relatively fast, it's 15, 20 seconds, it shouldn't bother him that much that when he comes back from his lunch break, he needs to start it again. And again, if we are able to automatically scale down the workspace, it means we can free up those EC2 instances. So it means we don't need to pay for those resources anymore at that time. Okay, so this is my favorite part as, like from administrator perspective. So the big challenge was how we can make sure that every single workspace or developer environment will be configured in a consistent way. How we can find that works on my machine issue, right? So NatWest has some globally applicable configuration. Usually it's related to, let's say, your Maven repositories, your internal certificates. This is the same type of config, regardless of developer, regardless of the team, regardless of the framework or language they use. This configuration is required for every single developer. And the way we do it, so either you could manually pre-populate it per user, but the way we do it, we define it just once using the namespace config operator. We have literally one custom resource on the cluster. We have one object on the cluster. And that operator, it automatically copies that config to every single user namespace. And then DevSpace's operator mounts it to actual workspace spots. So what exactly is that configuration? As I said, it could be certificates of internal services, it could be settings XML, it could be npm config, but it also could be resource quotas, for example. We don't want allow developers to go overboard with what resources they are using. And this is really elegant way how to achieve that consistent config across your thousands of potential developers. And on the roadmap, we are also contemplating of integrating our platform with GitOps, whether it's Argo or Flux, doesn't really matter. So you want to manage the dev spaces operator lifecycle using GitOps. And if we ever need to, we can also manage individual developers or users using GitOps. So these are, I would say, the main task or the main ideas which we put in configuring the platform. This is what we did in order to make the platform configured in a consistent way, and this is what we did to make it ready from basically day one for developers. Okay, so we did all of that work as administrators, but here comes the developer. Okay, he might have different ideas about how he want to use the platform. So before I show you the next slide, one more quick show of hands. Who in this room is current or former engineer or developer? That's amazing, that's okay. And who knows Java or Maven? Okay, that's awesome. So, okay, so on the next slide, so there is one thing which we want our developers to learn. Please don't hate me, I know it's YAML. I know you are sick of YAML. But this particular file is really good. For all your developers sitting out there, this is a really good thing. So this file on the screen right now, it's called the Devfile. It's basically your workspace or development environment descriptor. So it's important to say you are not required to use the Devfile. If you don't, you will be handed all the default values, which is perfectly fine. But if you do use the Devfile, it allows you to squeeze all the potential from the platform. So let's talk about, so by the way, this file is versioned in the Git, so we can give developers the initial template, for example, using Backstage. But then developers need to take over and just maintain it as part of their Git workflow. So first and foremost, developers can decide what kind of image they will use where that VS Code instance is going to be spin up. So by default, Red Hat already supplies UDI image. UDI stands for Universal Development Image. This image already bundles stuff like Java, Go, Maven, Python, and all the usual well-known tools and frameworks. And it's fully supported by Red Hat. So this means all the maintenance, all the CVE scanning, all the upgrades, it's handled by Red Hat, so you as a customer don't have to. It's obviously customizable, so you can build your custom image, you can layer on top of your company-specific tools, but for getting started, we are ready to go on a day one. So next thing, which I think is extremely powerful for developers, they can actually say, this is how much RAM and this is how much CPU I need for this particular project in my local environment. So how cool is that? Like, there is no alternative solution for this using VDI and Citrix. It just doesn't exist. But using dev spaces, if you have, let's say, CPU-intensive project or memory-intensive project like some AI ML workload, or if you are doing Quarkus native compilation, you can say, I need more. Obviously, this goes hand in hand with resource quotas. We don't necessarily want to allow like unlimited usage of resources, but they have full control, or almost full control of how much resources they can use. Next, they can expose their locally running applications through either an OpenShift service or OpenShift route, which can be extremely useful for like Postman testing or SWAB UI testing, or simply for the cross-collaboration purposes with your other team members. They can also make sure to cache and persist particular directories in your workspace. Really common use case is to cache your Maven library, which means if your workspace will be scaled down and then scaled up again, your Maven clean package won't take 15 minutes anymore, but it will take 15 seconds because everything was cached in that persistent volume. And finally, they can also pre-populate their workspaces with some common shortcuts for the inner or outer development loop. Okay, so this is a view of a user namespace of on your Kubernetes or OpenShift cluster. So yeah, this thing, yeah. So in here you can see the resources which we put there using namespace configurator operator. So we defined them once, but they are automatically installed in every user namespace. Then DevSpaces operator actually injects and mount those files into the actual pods, right? It's here. These are some other stuff which we configured using namespace config operator. This is perhaps my favorite feature. I'm not sure if you noticed on that previous slide with the Devfile that the list of containers, that was actually an array. And why is that important? It's important because you can configure more than one container. You don't need to limit yourself to running a single container with VS Code. You can spin up locally running Postgres, or Kafka Broker, or Artemis, or whatever, even local stack, so you can mock S3 buckets directly in your workspace. Again, whenever I go to like Windows-based customers, I was never aware of how to do it on Windows environments ever. So if you are familiar with like Docker Compose, this is really similar. It just works online in your browser. Like this is by far my favorite feature from developer perspective. Like how cool is this, honestly? So we did all of that. We set up the platform, we configured the platform, and we asked developers, please learn what is Devfile, and please take ownership of it. So once they did all of that, I just want to show you how they can actually use the platform in like 3 really, really simple steps. So this is a really cool demo feature, but I was afraid to put like a live demo feature because of the demo gods. But what we typically do, we embed like a clickable link in like a README of that particular Git repo. So this link here, it contains 2 parts. One part is your dev spaces URL, and the second part is the Git URL. So developer simply clicks on that link. So that's the first step. So step number 1 is click. Then this developer is redirected to another browser window. And at this stage, dev spaces operator needs to load Devfile. It needs to load, parse, and process the Devfile. It needs to apply those config maps, those files, those persistence values, etc. So this is the load phase. Again, if we pre-cache the images, this usually takes up to 20 seconds, not more. And the third step is access. That's it, really. So now we are looking at the fully pre-configured workspace. So I have a Java extension pre-installed out of the box. I have Maven settings XML pre-configured. I have NatWest specific certificates already mounted. My Java is here. My Git repository was cloned automatically as part of the load. No credentials needed, nothing. It just works. And this is actually my last slide. So I hope you like the idea. This is what we are working on at NatWest. We are not at the end of the journey, of course. We have plenty of things in the roadmap. We are gradually adding more languages and more features. So we started with Java. We are adding Node. We plan to add Python, etc. All of these languages requires different approaches in terms of configuration. You need to talk to different repositories or Nexus or Artifactory. So all of that requires certain steps on our part. The feedback from developers is positive so far. So with this being said, I'd like to hand it over to Colin for a summary.
Yeah, thanks very much, Anton. That was great. Thank you. So just to summarize, get the button working. Yeah, so what have we discussed today? The implications for engineering at a €300 bank. So obviously there's lots of stuff that we need to do there. Introducing a modern tool chain across the bank. We have tool chains, but we need to simplify them and modernize. Our approach and how that's been done with our assistance with Red Hat. And more details on dev spaces. So obviously Anton to take you through some of the deep dive config that we've been deploying. And hopefully some helpful hints for you to use that in your own deployments. So thanks very much for your time today, everyone. Thank you.
So I think we have some time for Q&A if there are some...
if there's any questions, feel free to ask. Yeah.
Two questions more so around guardrails. So how do your developers know what the CPU limits are? And then 2 is in terms of caching, do you have a limit on how long you're caching files for? Maybe 60 days, 90 days, or is it indefinite?
So we kind of hope that the dev spaces adoption kind of forces developers to learn the Kubernetes basics. Like that's the main idea. So we are actually working on some enablement material in collaboration with NatWest and with Red Hat training team. So it will be part of like that initial onboarding that, hey, if you're not familiar with Kubernetes, here is what you need to go through as part of like the first week at the company, for example. So that's the first question. For the second, how it works that if there is an actually new dev spaces version, you need to start caching new set of images anyway, so that kind of naturally, removes the old ones. So this usually happens like every 6 or 7 weeks.
I was wondering, I know that you can run multiple images, but for the first image that you run, are there any sort of prerequisites that has to have? So if you weren't to use the UDI, could you just use like a minimal node image or something like that that just runs?
So there are some hidden requirements required by like what VS Code specifically expects to have available, so it can be successfully launched. Not very well documented because it's considered from engineering perspective as an implementation detail. So these are like little things like OpenSSL library or your NPM needs to be on the path, for example. But I have colleagues personally who actually build that development image completely from scratch. Because obviously, this is an opinionated choice, which comes with all the different toolings and frameworks. It's probably not applicable to every single development use case. So we have customers, we have colleagues who are building those, let's say, Java-focused images, which are 5 times lighter, in terms of size. So that's perfectly possible. And yeah, there are some quirks which needs to be ticked. Again, OpenSSL, for example. There could be more, but it's certainly possible, and we have use cases where we know this is happening.
Is there anywhere where I can find any documentation like this? I'm in the same pathway myself, trying to build that image, and it's really challenging.
Just take a picture of my name, and I can be the documentation for you, man.
Anybody else?
Thank you for your presentation. I just want to know if developer, when the dev space of developer is great, and if he needs some specific library or specific tool, what you can manage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a great question. So there are 2 options. One is he would have to work internally with that company to understand how he can build a custom image which would have the tool. So that would be, I would say, preferred long-term solution for his particular team. But what we did also in the past, when I just needed a quick and dirty solution, like right now, and I just couldn't bother to sync up with some other teams, there is this neat trick where in the Devfile directly, you can configure so-called event hooks. One of those event hooks is called post start. So we are literally doing curl or wget, and you can download CLI or binary from GitHub. You can extract it using tar or unzip, and you can add it to a path. So that's what I personally done numerous times already. So that's a neat way how you can, obviously the connectivity must be in place, so you can curl stuff from GitHub. If it's not in place, then you need to stick with the first option of building a proper custom image. Yeah. So these are 2 options.
And so after the next time the developer will provide their space, the profile is unregistered or?
Sorry, profile or?
The profile of the dev, if you want, the next time you want to have that specific tool.
So Devfile sits with the Git repo, and this means those workspaces are reproducible. So even if you kill your workspace and you recreate it from scratch using the same Git repo with that particular Devfile, you'll always get the same thing, which means you can consistently have the same experience. Once you configure the Devfile, you'll always have it there.
That's good.
Just yourself?
So we are still using official UDI images, which means we don't really care about maintaining those because Red Hat does it for us. And yeah, so obviously if, I anticipated in the near future, we might need to start thinking about our own custom images. Usually this comes as a requirement from the teams and developers we are talking to. So like Java developers, that's easy. All they need is Java and Maven. But different teams have different requirements, and I think it's bound to happen that at some point we'll have to build our custom image. But right now we are just relying on what the Red Hat provides.
There was another question, I think yourself. Yeah.
Practical one, so talk about the customization, key mapping, shortcuts, stuff like that works on a dedicated IDE installed on the computer. So how it works, just out of the box, or is it possible to customize some
So you can add custom commands. Well, they are basically shortcuts, so you will actually see them in VS Code under tasks section, so developers can literally just click, let's say Maven build, and it will execute the whole thing in a terminal automatically. You can also like configure your extensions, your like VS Code settings, for example, like your styling and whatnot. So it is configurable to an extent. I'm not sure if I fully answered your question. Maybe.
I was just thinking about having an install ID on your laptop or whatever. You might have some options with shortcuts, key mappings.
Yeah, so you can actually pass in, like, for example, the VS Code configuration file, like the settings.json. So if that will be part of your repo, it will actually be respected and applied to your online VS Code instance. So if there is an answer on like VS Code level, for example, you can make it part of your Git repo and settings.json. So it would be processed properly.
But adding to that, so let's say you have a bunch of developers that have their own unique settings that they like to have with VS Code.
Yeah, so there is an answer also for that, which I just recently discovered. So for example, they can, let's say they open a workspace and they manually configure some settings in IntelliJ or VS Code. So it's a completely undocumented feature. But VS Code will, when that happens, when user will configure something inside the VS Code manually, it will actually be stored in like in-browser database. Forgot the name, maybe some of you know here. But like there is some default in-browser database. So as long as the developer will keep using the same browser for accessing the workspaces, he will get the consistent configuration across all the workspaces. So that's another like option how to do it.
Yeah, another question there.
Did you find a solution for copying like user-specific files or mounting them into the pod? So for example, like a GPG key to the Git signing or something like a PaaS token or something like that. Yeah, I think like whether it's this or Git or something like that, there seems to be like an easy solution.
So I think Vault integration is on the roadmap as the next best thing. So I assume we'll be working on exactly that, but we're not working on it right now. But yeah, like it's in our backlog, the Vault integration. Maybe, I'm not sure if Colin has some more ideas about about Vault. I just heard that it's coming.
Yeah, so Vault's a strategic tool for that sort of thing in the bank, so it will need to integrate to Vault. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question about the namespace configuration operator. Do you pre-create the namespaces for users?
You could, but we don't. Because if we had to pre-create them, it means we would have to know the username in advance, which we don't really know. So the way it works, when a developer logs in for the very first time, the Namespaces operator will create a namespace with a unique label. That's actually that's how our namespace config operator is tied to that namespace because of that one label. And also the operator will also inject some very specific role bindings, which is something I forgot to explain in the session. So that developer only has access to his particular namespace. Because of the role binding, he can't really step outside of the boundaries of his namespace. So he can't just go, going around the cluster, doing stuff. He can do whatever the role binding allows him to do in his own particular namespace.
Any other questions yet?
Yeah, sorry, any surprises in terms of costs? Like, like when you start rolling it out and you go from, 10 developers to 1,000 developers, they start using it, you start seeing, like, I'm saying from a financial perspective, any areas of discomfort or concerns? Or
Not yet, but that may well come up. So at the moment, we're just moving out of proof of concept. We're heading into sort of productionization. So cost is a big consideration, but the solutions we have in place already cost money. So this will be a different platform for developers to use. So obviously cost is a big thing for the bank as well, as Anton said. So we need to be careful.
consider bringing it back in on-prem later, it turned out, versus on the ROSA scenario, if you bring in your own?
That would need to be a consideration. So if the ROSA scenario proved to be expensive, we would have to look at how to bring that cost down if it exceeds what we're expecting in terms of budget. That'd be an option, but I guess one of the advantages of ROSA is it allows us to scale. So it'd be a trade-off around the scale, and yeah, because we'd have to scale up on-prem to handle that. No problem. Anybody else? No. Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming today. So it's good. Thank you. Thanks.